In 2021, in St. James Parish, Louisiana, a crew came out to do what crews always do in the river parishes: measure, mark, and move dirt. It wasn't a movie set. It wasn't a ghost hunt. It was paperwork and boots, survey stakes, clipboards, a schedule that doesn't care what the ground remembers. Then the instruments started talking back. Not with voices, with shapes, with clusters, with repeating voids that don't look like tree roots or old pipe trenches. The kind of pattern that makes a field tech stop joking and start whispering. The kind of pattern that turns project site into sensitive area in the space of one phone call. And the moment the word sensitive enters a work order, the rules change fast. Work paused. The boundary tightened. Someone higher up said the line that always comes first: no photographs. Another voice followed right behind it: no notes outside the chain. And then the most revealing instruction of all, the one that tells you exactly what this is really about: do not disturb. Not because of reverence. Because disturbance creates a record. Disturbance creates a count. Disturbance creates names that can't be erased again. In this place, the ground didn't just hold history. The ground was a liability. And liabilities get managed. Quietly. Professionally. Procedurally. Within hours, the language had done its work. Nobody said grave. Nobody said bodies. Nobody said enslaved. They said anomalies. They said avoidance. They said mitigation. They said, in modern words, what plantations said in old ones: keep it sealed. I'm starting here because what you're about to hear is not a single scandal with a single villain. It's a method, repeated so many times across so many decades that it starts to look like culture. A habit of erasing. A habit of substituting paper for people. A habit of treating silence as the safest form of truth. The crew in 2021 didn't invent that habit. They inherited it. The real story begins 170 years earlier, in 1851, on sugar ground, where the money came fast and the death came faster, and where a plantation earned a reputation so clean it sounded almost supernatural. No one escaped. That's the official story you'll hear in different costumes. Sometimes it's told like a boast. The overseers were vigilant. The patrols were tight. The river was watched. The dogs were trained. The fences were high. Sometimes it's told like a curiosity. A mysterious plantation where runaways never made it out. Sometimes it's smuggled into tourist language. A place notorious for discipline. But the story always lands in the same place: control. As if control explains everything. As if the absence of escape is proof of order. As if the missing are missing because the system worked. But that's not what the receipts show. The receipts don't always scream. Sometimes they whisper. Sometimes they look like routine. Sometimes they look like competence. And that's the most frightening part. The machinery of disappearance doesn't need gothic drama. It needs administration. It needs ledgers. It needs categories. It needs men who can write loss without ever writing life. Here's the first thing you have to understand about Louisiana sugar in 1851. It wasn't just agriculture. It was industrial pace without industrial protections. The harvest window was narrow. The processing was relentless. The work didn't wait for heat, illness, injury, or grief. Cane had to be cut, hauled, crushed, boiled, clarified, barreled. If the labor force slowed, the entire season's profit could rot in the fields. And in a system built on enslaved labor, profit rot never meant owners tightened their belts. It meant bodies tightened their grip on pain and kept moving. The plantation wasn't just land and a big house. It was a schedule, a clock, a furnace, a set of rooms and sheds where humans were treated like fuel. Now, when a place like that becomes known as the plantation where no one escaped, you're supposed to picture watchtowers and bloodhounds. Sometimes those existed. But reputations are marketing. Reputation is what you tell the outside world so they believe your machine is stable. Creditors like stability. Partners like stability. Neighbors like stability. Reputation doesn't need to be true in every detail. It needs to be useful. And in 1851, Louisiana, the most useful reputation a sugar operation could have was this: we don't lose labor. Not to flight. Not to resistance. Not to disorder. That's the public story. Clean. Controlled. Professional. The missing story starts when you look at what labor meant on paper. On paper, the workforce wasn't a community. It was an inventory. On paper, people were recorded as units, sometimes by first name, sometimes by age, sometimes by skill, sometimes by a number. On paper, pain is translated into euphemism. Corrected. Confined. Unfit. Removed. On paper, death is rarely a sentence. It's a margin note. A crossed out line. A gap that nobody is paid to ask about. And once you learn how the paper speaks, you start seeing how the paper hides. So I began where all buried record stories begin. Not with legends, but with systems. What laws, what incentives, what contracts, what mechanics created a world where a plantation could claim no escape and have people nod like that was normal. In 1851, the engine was straightforward. Sugar profit demanded uninterrupted labor, and enslaved people were the only workforce the system was willing to spend. The plantation leadership, owner, manager, overseer, didn't need to invent cruelty. They needed to optimize it. They needed an elegant solution to the problem every plantation faced. How do you keep human beings trapped when the entire human body is built for movement? The elegant solution was not just chains. It was isolation. It was categorization. It was cutting the world into zones and making certain zones invisible. In sugar parishes, you could make escape physically difficult by geography, the river, the swamps, the patrol roads, the sheer distance between safe places. But the more decisive barrier was social. You could make escape psychologically impossible by proving, again and again, that flight ends in punishment, and punishment ends in disappearance. You don't have to catch everyone. You have to make sure the ones who try become a lesson. And lessons don't require bodies to be returned. Lessons only require the message to spread. That's why the paper trail matters. The paper trail is where the plantation taught itself what it could get away with. You can see it in the priorities. You can see it in what gets recorded with precision versus what is allowed to blur. Owners get full names, full correspondence, dates, signatures. Their disputes are documented because money depends on clarity. The workforce, the people whose muscles actually create the sugar, are reduced to shorthand. In a world like that, erasure isn't a side effect. It's a feature. When you don't fully record a person, you don't fully account for what happens to them. And when you don't fully account for what happens to them, you can treat disappearance as a manageable outcome instead of a moral emergency. This is where the story splits into what I call two archives. The first is the official archive. Ledgers, inventories, production tallies, purchase lists, memos, letters about shipments and debts. It's the archive that keeps the machine running and keeps the owner safe. The second is the human archive. Oral memory, whispered warnings, family stories passed down like contraband, and, later, the fragments that survive when people finally get the slightest opening to speak in a form the state recognizes. The official archive is loud with numbers and quiet about bodies. The human archive is loud with bodies and quiet because speaking could get you killed. The horror is not that one archive lies and the other tells the truth. The horror is that the system was designed so the archive with power could always claim ignorance. And yet, even the official archive betrays itself. It has to. Because it is built by human hands, and human hands make edits. They cross out. They substitute. They continue payments. They rewrite categories. They create the exact pattern that becomes meaningful once you look for it. A person appears in a list, performs a function, then vanishes, while the work continues as if nothing happened. To keep this grounded, I built micro-portraits, not to sentimentalize, to force the record to admit a fact it tries to avoid. Each unit was a person with a body that bruised, bled, and eventually stopped. So let me give you 3. These are not heroic myths. These are the kinds of partial identities the plantation world allowed to exist, until it didn't. The first is a man recorded only as Isaac, mid-20s, assigned near the sugar house. The sugar house is where heat becomes policy, where accidents are common and exhaustion is routine. In a system like this, a sugar house worker is valuable right up until the moment he's injured. Then value becomes a question. Is he worth feeding while he heals, or is it cheaper to replace him and mark the original as removed? The record doesn't have to write, "We killed him." The record only has to stop writing his name. Isaac appears in the working tally. Then, after a noted disruption, a reduced output day, the kind of note that signals something went wrong, Isaac is absent. No death entry. No return to duty. No burial note. Just absence. And the next week, the tally shows the workforce stabilized. That's how erasure reads when it is functioning correctly. The second is a young woman listed as Marie, late teens, field labor. Field labor is where the body becomes a tool. The paper may record discipline incidents in language so dry it could be mistaken for bookkeeping. But the human archive, when it survives, remembers it differently. Who was targeted? Who was made an example? Who stopped appearing at evening roll call? Marie appears across multiple lines for weeks. Then a small mark suggests confined. The next page continues without her. What replaces her is not a note of grief, but a substitution, another first name, another age, another unit. The ledger keeps its balance. The plantation keeps its reputation. Marie becomes the kind of missing person that the official story can swallow whole. The third is a man called Baptiste, described as skilled, carpentry or repairs. Skilled workers are the ones you expect a system to protect, because they are useful. But usefulness doesn't protect you from cruelty. It makes you a bargaining chip. Baptiste appears in a compensation note, something like a valuation adjustment, the kind of bureaucratic detail owners love. Then there's a gap, pages where other workers continue and Baptiste does not. And later, a new line appears, a replacement for a skilled hand. That's how the official archive confesses without confessing. It doesn't say Baptiste died. It says the plantation needed another Baptiste. And in a place with a no-escape reputation, needing a replacement is a red flare. Because if nobody escapes, then labor only leaves one way: through the ground. Now, I need to be precise here. Because this is where irresponsible storytelling turns tragedy into entertainment. A missing name is not proof of murder all by itself. Paper gets lost. Clerks make errors. People are sold, transferred, moved. But when the same pattern repeats, when the same kinds of disappearances occur around the same pressure points, injury, punishment, peak season, outbreaks, then the absence stops being random. It becomes a design. And the design becomes visible when you compare what the plantation records in obsessive detail, barrels, tools, debts, with what it allows to blur people. This is the language of erasure. It's not just that names disappear. It's how they disappear. The official archive is careful about anything that could threaten the plantation's financial standing. It is careless about anything that could threaten its moral standing. That isn't an accident. That's a decision. Repeated. Institutionalized. Taught to the next generation as how business is done. By the time you reach the end of this first act of the story, you should feel the shape of the trap. The trap is not only physical, it's archival. It's psychological. If you control what gets written down, you control what can be proven later. And if you control what can be proven later, you control what can be punished. That's why silence as policy is not a metaphor. It is a survival mechanism for institutions that commit violence and plan to outlive the witnesses. And that brings us back to the cold open, back to that modern instruction. No photos, no notes. Do not disturb. People hear those words and think they're about respect. Sometimes they are. But in places built on unmarked graves, do not disturb can also mean do not count. Do not identify. Do not create a new archive that competes with the old one. In 1851, the plantation where no one escaped didn't need supernatural explanations. It needed a workforce recorded as disposable, a production schedule treated as sacred, and a paper system trained to swallow bodies without choking. The official story says no one got out. The missing story asks the question that makes administrators nervous, even now. If no one escaped, then where did they go? Because later, after the war, when the machinery of slavery is forced to change its vocabulary, the records start leaking a different truth. Not immediately, not cleanly, but enough. Enough to reveal what the plantation's reputation was really built on. Enough to suggest that the exit wasn't a route through the swamp or a boat on the river. It was a place you don't walk away from. And once you see that possibility, you can't unsee it. The ground stops being scenery. The ledger stops being boring. The silence stops sounding natural. It starts sounding engineered. In 1851, the sugar parishes sold an image of order. Straight rows, clean books, controlled bodies. But the records that survive, when you read them the way an investigator reads a crime scene, are full of things they refuse to describe plainly. They will tell you how many barrels moved, how many tools were purchased, how many days were lost. They will not tell you what a lost day costs in skin, lungs, bone. They will not tell you how heat makes people stupid, how a furnace makes men collapse without drama, how cane knives turn a slip into a missing finger, how infection turns a cut into a death sentence when the system has decided your body is cheaper than your recovery. The cruelty doesn't need a whip to exist. It can live inside ration lines, inside housing notes, inside the silence around sickness. This is what I mean when I say the paperwork doesn't describe conditions, because describing them would create responsibility. In the daily logics of a sugar plantation, conditions were not treated as a moral question. They were treated as a throughput problem. Housing is measured by capacity. not dignity. Food is measured by cost, not nutrition. Tools are measured by durability, not safety. Discipline is measured by compliance, not justice. And sickness, especially sickness, becomes the perfect bureaucratic weapon because it lets an institution kill you while claiming nature did it. Fever, dysentery, respiratory infections, injuries that fester, all of it can be filed as misfortune. But misfortune doesn't produce neat patterns. Policy does. You see policy in the administrative language that keeps repeating. Unfit, confined, corrected, sent away for care. Those phrases are not neutral. They are shields. They turn violence into procedure. They turn harm into management. They turn a person into a line item that can be moved off the page. And yes, there were outsiders. In 1851 Louisiana, the plantation ecosystem still needed people who came from outside the quarters. Visiting clergy, physicians, inspectors, business associates, sometimes an agent checking production, sometimes a neighbor dropping in to verify a deal. Their words matter because they write differently. They're not trying to conceal daily brutality. They're trying to normalize it, which is its own kind of confession. When an outsider notes good order or efficient discipline, what they really mean is that they didn't hear screaming where it could embarrass the owner. When they mention a temporary sickness among the hands, what they really mean is a workforce being consumed and replaced like parts in a machine. There is usually a first incident, the kind that should change everything if human life mattered more than output. In a sugar operation, it can be an outbreak that spreads through cramped quarters, or a collapse inside the sugar house where heat and steam and exhaustion meet, or a fire that turns a routine night into chaos. The details vary across plantations, but the institutional response is consistent. Minimize, reframe, continue. A serious event becomes a disruption. A body becomes a loss. A death becomes removed. The record rarely says, someone died because we pushed them past endurance. As it says, production reduced. The machine protects itself by converting suffering into numbers. This is where the horror becomes specifically historical, not supernatural. The system is designed so that even when catastrophe occurs, the paperwork makes it look like nothing happened. The absence of description is not ignorance. It is intent. In 1851, describing conditions honestly would have created questions. Questions create witnesses. Witnesses create liability. So the record learns to speak in a way that sterilizes its own violence. Now listen carefully, because this is the pivot. Conditions alone do not prove disappearance. But conditions create the perfect environment for disappearance to be used as a solution. When bodies break, the plantation has two choices: care or replace. Care costs food, time, and attention. Replace costs money, but not as much as you think when the entire system is built to feed on human beings. And the plantation with a no-one-escaped reputation had a third, darker advantage. It could erase labor without letting rumors spread beyond its fence. No one escapes. No one tells. No one returns to contradict the story. So you start looking for the moment where conditions stop being background cruelty and start becoming a mechanism. It often appears as a repeating anomaly in the books, an administrative fingerprint. Names replaced. Lines crossed out. Payments or tallies continuing while people do not. The machine keeps running. The person stops appearing. That is not random. That is substitution. In 1851, if you scan the workforce lists the way you'd scan a suspect's phone records, You look for clusters and timing. A man appears regularly in the tally, then suddenly disappears right after a note that suggests injury or discipline. A young woman's name repeats for weeks, then stops after a confinement mark, and a new name appears in the same slot. A skilled worker vanishes, and the next entries mention the need to secure another hand with the same skill. Not grief. Not explanation. Procurement. Replacement. It is the language of erasure doing its job, turning a human being into an interchangeable part. And the most disturbing pattern, the one that turns this from brutal plantation life into something closer to an organized disappearance, is when the paperwork continues as if the missing person is still being economically accounted for. A valuation line that doesn't adjust when a person vanishes. A productivity expectation that doesn't change. A ration line that reduces, but without naming death. It's subtle, but it's telling. The institution is aware something happened, but refuses to name it in a way that could be challenged. This is where I introduce the question that creates danger. Where did they go? In a normal workplace, that question triggers investigations, reports, bodies recovered, families notified. On a plantation, that question is treated like insubordination, because the answer is never supposed to be public. Sent away for care is the safe phrase. It ends the conversation. It doesn't require follow-up. It doesn't require a location. It doesn't require a grave. And when the follow-up never appears, when the person never re-enters the record, you start to understand what the phrase is really for. It's not for care. It's for disappearance. I can't stress this enough. The plantation ledger is not a diary. It is an instrument of control. Its purpose is not to tell the truth. Its purpose is to keep the system functioning and defensible. That's why the anomalies matter more than the narratives. A narrative can be crafted. An anomaly is a leak. An anomaly is the machine accidentally revealing its own hidden compartments. And in Louisiana, hidden compartments are not theoretical. They are geographic. Sugar ground has edges, tree lines, low fields, swamp margins, places where a person can be taken without being seen by the road. The plantation that prided itself on no escape would need somewhere to put the bodies that threatened its reputation. Bodies of the injured, the punished, the unfit, the ones who had seen too much or resisted too publicly. If you never let a runaway reach the outside world, you keep the myth intact. If you never let a death become a story with a name, you keep the myth intact. Silence is not just absence. Silence is maintenance. So let me be plain, because moral language matters when the record is trying to numb you. When a system reduces people to numbers, it becomes easy to murder without calling it murder. When a system treats illness and injury as waste, it becomes easy to dispose of the waste without calling it disposal. When a system trains its own paperwork to omit the human details, it becomes easy for later generations to claim, "We didn't know." But the omissions themselves are knowledge. The repeated decisions to not record, not describe, not follow up, those are admissions. In 1851, the plantation's public story is a boast. No one escaped. The ledger's private story is quieter and uglier. People vanished, and the paperwork substituted them like worn-out tools. The institution did not merely rely on fear to prevent flight. It relied on erasure to prevent proof. And once you see that, the reputation changes shape. No one escaped stops sounding like security. It starts sounding like a warning. Because if no one escapes, then the exits are not roads. They are not rivers. They are not routes you can run. They are the places the record refuses to name, where the missing go to keep the living obedient. And if we let that remain a rumor, If we let it remain a vague legend about harsh discipline, then we become part of the same policy. We become the modern administrators of silence. The responsibility is simple. When the paper hides a person, you say the person's absence out loud. You do not let the ledger be the final judge of who existed. You do not let "sent away" end the story. You keep asking the question the system was built to punish. Where did they go? In 1851, there is always a season when the plantation stops pretending it's a community and reveals what it really is. A furnace that runs on human bodies. On sugar ground, that season is not metaphor. It is calendar. It is heat, insects, rot, and the narrow math of profit. The crisis window is when everything spikes at once: exhaustion, disease, injury, discipline, and the panic of managers who can see the harvest clock ticking down like a threat. You can feel it even in the calmest paperwork. A sudden density of notes. A tightening of language. Requests for hands. Requests for replacements. Complaints about idleness that are really complaints about bodies failing. And then the most telling sign of all. The record begins to change its habits. It becomes less descriptive, not more. The worse it gets, the less they say. That is not because nothing happened. That is because someone decided certain things must not exist on paper. This is the moment the myth of "no one escaped" becomes operational. Earlier, it was reputation. In the crisis summer, it becomes enforcement. In a functioning system of terror, a person who runs has to be turned into a lesson. But lessons take time, and time is exactly what a sugar operation cannot spare during peak season. So the institution reaches for faster tools, tools that don't require public spectacle, tools that don't require witnesses, tools that don't require a return. I wish I could tell you this part is speculation. It isn't. It's the only conclusion that matches the pattern. When the pressure peaks, disappearances cluster. When disappearances cluster, replacements spike. When replacements spike, someone is managing the workforce like inventory, removing defective units and ordering more. And in 1851 Louisiana, there is a particular kind of place the record can hint at without naming. A separate holding area. A shed. A locked room. A quarantine space. A basement. An off-site pit. A restricted ward that functions as a valve. When the system needs to reduce risk, risk of revolt, risk of flight, risk of rumor, it isolates people until they either return to labor or stop being a problem. You don't have to imagine a dungeon to understand the mechanism. You only have to understand what happens when a plantation cannot afford disorder and cannot afford accountability. The crisis window turns administrators into predators. Not because they are uniquely evil, but because the incentives reward disappearance. If a worker is sick, an outbreak threatens the whole labor force. Isolation becomes public health. If a worker is injured, recovery slows production. Removal becomes efficiency. If a worker is defiant, defiance spreads. Containment becomes discipline. And if a worker tries to run, the reputation is at stake. The response becomes total, not to retrieve a person, but to protect the myth. No one escapes. Meaning, no one returns to tell the story. In this window, you also see a rise in correspondence that is not meant to be moral. It's meant to be logistical. Letters that request more hands. Messages that complain about shortages. Notes that treat human beings like parts in a mill. If one breaks, replace it before the machine stalls. This is where the plantation's cruelty becomes visible as a supply chain. It is not chaos. It is management. And then, because even systems of silence have pressure points, people with leverage begin to ask questions. Not because they are saints, but because money hates uncertainty. This is where the confrontation letters enter. Owners, contractors, creditors, insurers, families of hired staff, neighboring planters who lent hands temporarily and want them returned. Anyone whose property interest or financial expectation is disrupted by the plantation's quiet removals. They do what ordinary powerless people could not safely do. They demand receipts. They ask the question the plantation wants to keep illegal. Where is the person? These letters have a predictable structure. They begin polite, because the writer assumes there is a simple explanation. We have not received the return of. We were promised. Please account for. Then the tone sharpens. Return them or provide proof. Then the threat appears, not a moral threat, a legal or financial one. We will seek remedy. We will notify. We will withdraw support. The institution responds quickly when leverage is involved. That is the tell. When the missing are poor and enslaved, silence is easy. When the missing represent money that belongs to someone else, silence becomes expensive. The responses are defensive and deliberately vague. They offer reassurance without detail. They replace facts with posture. They use the same evasive phrases you've already learned to fear. Sent away, unwell, removed, no longer present, not in condition, circumstances beyond control. The key point is not what they say. It's what they refuse to say. They do not name a grave. They do not name a date of death. They do not name a location. They do not produce a body. They do not produce a witness. They do not produce a chain of custody. They produce language designed to end the conversation while giving the appearance of cooperation. And sometimes, only sometimes, under pressure, a line slips through that changes everything. A sentence that admits death or disappearance while still hiding its mechanics. Not we killed him. Not we buried her. But something like, he did not recover. She is no longer among the hands. He was lost. Lost. As if a human being is a misplaced tool. As if death is a clerical error. That choice of word is not accidental. It is strategy. If you call a death loss, you turn it into an accounting event instead of a crime. If you call a disappearance sent away, you turn it into administrative care instead of elimination. This is how institutions commit violence and still look respectable on paper. Here's what the confrontation letters establish, beyond any single case. Admissions only occur under pressure. Silence is the default procedure. Accountability is not offered. It is extracted. And that matters because it tells you how to read the entire archive. If a system only confesses when forced, then everything it says voluntarily is designed for self-protection. That doesn't mean the record is useless. It means you must treat it like a suspect statement. What's missing is as important as what's present. In the crisis window of 1851, the plantation's internal logic is simple. Keep production moving. Prevent flight. Contain rumor. Replace losses fast. And if anyone asks too loudly, answer just enough to preserve relationships, then return to silence. This is not a story of one violent night. It is a story of a system that learned how to erase without leaving fingerprints. The fingerprints are in the patterns. Disappearances clustered in peak season, replacements requested in clusters, and the institution's sudden fluency and vagueness. And this is where the moral burden lands on us. Because a confrontation letter is not written for the enslaved. It is written for property interests. That's what makes it so damning. The system will document a disappearance only when someone with power demands documentation. Otherwise, the missing are expected to vanish without paperwork, without grief, without public memory. That is not just cruelty. That is an attempt to delete a human being from the future. So when you hear, "no one escaped," understand what the phrase is doing. It is not just describing surveillance. It is announcing policy. It is telling you the plantation controlled more than the roads and the river. It controlled the record. It controlled who could be missed and who must be accounted for. In 1851, during the crisis summer, the plantation's greatest weapon was not the whip or the gun. It was the ability to make a person disappear and then make the disappearance sound like nothing at all. And our responsibility, if we claim to be civilized, if we claim history matters, is to refuse that last step. Refuse the euphemism. Refuse the clean story. Refuse to let silence pass as innocence. Because when a system perfects the art of unrecorded death, the only counterforce is deliberate memory. Naming what they tried to keep nameless, and insisting the missing count even when the ledger pretends they don't. Silence on a plantation is not an atmosphere. It is a procedure. In 1851, the plantation that bragged "no one escaped" did not rely on one brutal overseer or one secret pit. It relied on a system that could operate with dozens of participants, each doing a small part without ever having to admit, even to themselves, what the whole machine was doing. That is how institutional violence survives. Not through theatrical evil, but through roles, routines, and paperwork that turns murder into administration. The cover-up mechanism begins with language. Not the dramatic kind. The kind that feels safe. Euphemisms that let a man write cruelty while pretending he's writing logistics. Removed. Disposed. Transferred. Sent away. Lost. Every one of those words is a door. And behind each door is a human being whose name is now optional. Once a person becomes optional, you can do anything to them and still claim the record is complete. You don't need to destroy every document. You only need to control what the documents are allowed to say. Then come the missing pages. They don't have to be torn out in some midnight conspiracy. Sometimes they're simply never filed. Sometimes they're kept in a separate annex that is restricted. Sometimes a logbook is marked "lost" at the exact moment it would have contained the details that matter. This is what people misunderstand about cover-ups. They imagine a single dramatic act. But the real cover-up is repetition. A habit of keeping the most incriminating facts off the main record. A habit of splitting information across different books, different hands, different locations, so no one sheet of paper ever says the whole truth. And if you want to understand how a plantation can make people vanish without triggering immediate outside outrage, you have to understand burial. Not as a spiritual subject, this system did not treat it spiritually, but as a logistics subject. Burial on plantation land was not always formal, not always marked, and often segregated by design. An unmarked burial ground is the perfect instrument for erasure. It solves the "where did the body go" problem while creating no new document to haunt the institution later. If the grave has no marker and the record has no name, the death becomes a rumor. Rumors can be managed. Receipts are harder. Now stack those mechanisms together and the picture becomes clear. A person disappears. The ledger substitutes a name. The correspondence requests replacements. Any detailed incident report goes into a restricted file, or never exists at all. The burial is unmarked, off the main road, near a tree line or low field where flood and time can do their work. The institution stays clean because the dirt is doing the dirty part. That is what silence as policy looks like when it's functioning. The record remains polite while the ground becomes crowded. And here's the most damning part. The system does not require everyone to know. The bookkeeper only knows he is copying numbers. The overseer only knows he is enforcing discipline. The owner only knows he wants output and order. A local official only knows he doesn't want trouble. A neighbor only knows the plantation is strict. None of them need to sit in a room and agree on murder. They only need to keep performing their roles inside a structure that rewards disappearance and punishes disclosure. This is why the myth of "no one escaped" is so useful. It is a reputation that does two jobs at once. It terrifies the enslaved into compliance, and it reassures the outside world that the operation is stable. Stability is the mask. Stability is the cover. If this were only an 1851 story, it would already be grotesque. But the outline of this crime is not confined to the antebellum years. The mechanism persists because the incentive persists. Protect the institution. Protect the land value. Protect the reputation. Avoid account. And that brings us to the second discovery, the one that happens later, when the old plantation is no longer only a plantation, when it becomes property, development, heritage, industry, when the ground is asked to carry new projects on top of old graves. Jump forward decades. Not one neat date, but a pattern across the late 19th and 20th centuries. Roads widened, levees reinforced, canals cut, pipelines planned, buildings renovated. In those moments, the ground is disturbed just enough to threaten the old silence. A worker's shovel hits something that isn't a root. A foundation trench reveals a line of darker soil. A storm exposes fragments that were never meant to see daylight. Sometimes it's bones. Sometimes it's coffin hardware. Sometimes it's nothing you can name in public without consequences. And once again, the institutional reflex appears. Not investigate, not identify, not tell the truth, but manage. In these later decades, the vocabulary changes, but the decision remains the same. The plantation era said, disposed and removed. The modern era says, anomaly and avoidance. The plantation era kept a burial ground unmarked. The modern era keeps it unexcavated. The plantation era punished witnesses. The modern era buries findings in process. Different century, same tactic. Limit what becomes official. And then, because history is cruel, the second discovery often comes with a second burial, not of bodies, but of evidence. A report that is drafted and never finalized. A memo that circulates quietly and then disappears into a file cabinet. A survey map marked sensitive that becomes inaccessible to the public. A sealed room in an old structure that is documented, then resealed. The same choice repeats. Reseal, rebury, reclassify. The ground is allowed to keep its secrets, not because secrets are sacred, but because secrets are convenient. This is where one person becomes the hinge. Not a hero in a cape. A clerk who keeps a copy. A surveyor who scribbles initials in a notebook. A local worker who writes down what was found and where before being told to stop. A descendant who hears the story and refuses to let it die with the elders. The institution can suppress an official report. It cannot fully control private memory. So these people keep fragments, boxes of papers, notebooks, hand-drawn maps, letters never mailed. Private archives. The kinds of archives that exist precisely because the public one is designed to fail. And the horror of it is not only that this happens, it's that it happens with the same tone every time. Calm. Professional. Clean. A shutdown notice. A restricted area. A recommendation to avoid disturbance. A promise that proper procedures were followed. That word again. Procedure is what you call it when you want the world to believe nothing immoral occurred. But procedure can be immoral. Procedure can be a weapon. Procedure can be a method of keeping the dead uncounted. So when I say silence is policy, I'm not accusing a single person of plotting across centuries. I'm accusing institutions of learning, of inheriting techniques, of discovering, again and again, that the cheapest way to survive scandal is to prevent proof. That is the continuity that should haunt you. The same plantation ground can swallow people in 1851 and swallow evidence in 1951 and swallow findings in 2021, all under different vocabularies, all under the same moral logic. Protect the name. Protect the asset. Let the bodies remain unnamed. And if you're tempted to look away because it's old, because it's complex, because we can't know for sure, remember this. Uncertainty is often manufactured. The unknowns are not always natural. They are the product of choices, missing pages, unmarked burials, resealed reports, avoided excavations. People made decisions so that future generations could shrug. The shrug is the final stage of the cover-up. That is why the second discovery matters. It proves the first erasure was not just a moment of cruelty, it was a template. It shows the same reflex repeating. When the ground threatens to speak, the institution tells it to shut up. And the only way that command works is if we cooperate, if we accept euphemisms, if we accept avoidance, if we accept silence as neutral. It isn't. Silence is not the absence of information here. Silence is the strategy. And every time the strategy succeeds, the plantation's original claim, no one escaped, wins again, because it doesn't just mean no one escaped the fences. It means no one escaped the archive. There is a moment in every buried record case when the official archive stops being the main battlefield. Not because it becomes irrelevant, but because you finally understand what it was designed to do. Protect the institution by distributing truth into fragments too small to prosecute. That's when the private archive appears, not as a romantic relic, but as an indictment. Boxes. Notebooks. Draft chapters with torn staples. Marginalia. A researcher's hand trying to stitch together what the ledger was built to prevent. Account. In Louisiana, after the war, the paper landscape changes. You start seeing new kinds of documents, new kinds of complaints, new kinds of admissions. The most important shift is simple. By 1865, and especially through the late 1860s, more black voices enter paperwork, not on equal terms, not safely, but enough to leave a trace. Employers and officials now have to use new language. Labor contracts, vagrancy, apprenticeship, trespass, outrages, missing. This is where the plantation's old claim, no one escaped, collides with a new reality. People begin trying to walk away with legal identity. The system responds by reinventing containment in a fresh vocabulary. And in the gap between old control and new paperwork, the private archive is born because the official one remains allergic to accountability. Imagine a researcher working in the early 20th century, say 1910 to 1930, when plantation myth is being polished into heritage, when the old families want their names cleaned and their properties framed as tradition. This researcher is not hunting ghosts. They're hunting proof. They assemble fragments. A plantation roster here, a church burial register there, a post-war complaint buried in a stack of county records, an oral testimony from a descendant who remembers a patch of ground everyone avoided. They collect small items that would look meaningless alone. Initials scratched into metal, a note about a restricted field, a story about a night wagon, a map that marks low ground without explaining why. The pattern only emerges when someone is stubborn enough to line up hundreds of small pieces and refuse to accept coincidence as an answer. This is what the private archive does that the official archive refuses to do. It connects. It takes the crossed-out names and asks what replaces them. It takes the phrase, "sent away," and asks where. It takes the reputation, "no one escaped," and treats it like a confession, not a brag. And that connecting work is dangerous, not because it's dramatic, but because it threatens property. In Louisiana, property is often more protected than truth. The moment a researcher begins implying that an estate's discipline was not merely harsh but systematically lethal, implying that the exit was a burial ground, the institutional response is predictable. Not debate. Not refutation. Control. The pushback rarely comes as a direct threat. It comes as conditions. We can grant you access, but you must share your notes. We can support publication, but certain passages need to be softened. We can provide funding, but the tone must be respectful. Respectful is the code word. Respectful means, don't name the crime. Respectful means, don't attach the violence to the family name. Respectful means, don't turn rumor into record. Respectful means keep the plantation a place of architecture and commerce, not a place of disposal. And when the researcher refuses, the institution reaches for the cleanest weapon it has. Exclusion. No access. No funding. No cooperation. No publication. So the researcher capitulates publicly and preserves privately. This is the hinge of the story. They remove a chapter, cut a section, rewrite an introduction to sound balanced. They take out the phrase that would have been undeniable, but they don't destroy it. They don't burn the pages. They put them in a box. They label it something small, something that won't attract attention. Notes. Draft. Appendix. They keep the dangerous part in private because the public record is still governed by reputation. This is not cowardice. It's survival. In a system designed to erase, even partial preservation becomes an act of resistance. And decades later, that box surfaces. Maybe through an estate sale. Maybe through a granddaughter cleaning out a study. Maybe through a local historian who finally gets access to a collection no institution bothered to catalog. The private archive is always found like this, by accident, or by grief, or by someone who doesn't understand what they're holding until they read it. And when it is read, the case changes. Because the private archive is where the official record's silences are named. It's where missing pages become a deliberate absence. It's where the researcher writes the sentence that the institution refused to print. That the plantation's no-escape reputation did not merely describe surveillance. It described what happened to those who tried. Now, even with the private archive, the institution still has a defense. You can't prove it without excavation. That's the modern version of the same old trick. In 1851, they made sure there were no markers and no paperwork. In the modern era, they make sure there's no disturbance and no count. Which brings us to the technical report, the cleanest, most contemporary form of silence. By the late 20th century and into the 21st, the tools for seeing into the ground improve. Surveys can detect voids, disturbances, patterns that are consistent with graves. Structural scans can flag anomalies that don't match natural features. And when those findings appear on paper, the language is clinical. It avoids the word human. It avoids the word burial. It speaks in probabilities, in consistency, in features, in returns. The report is written as if it exists outside morality. But the recommendation section always tells you who the report really serves. We recommend against excavation. Not because the truth is too fragile, because excavation produces facts. Facts trigger obligations. Obligations trigger costs. Legal, financial, reputational. Excavation turns anomaly into body, and body into person, and person into name. And once names enter the record, the plantation's old machine breaks. Because the machine ran on the principle that the dead would remain uncounted. So the modern report offers a solution that sounds humane and functions as concealment. Avoid. Reroute. Cap the area. Monitor. No further work at this time. The words are soft, but the effect is hard. The ground stays sealed. The descendants remain without answers. The institution remains protected. The dead remain unnamed. This is the continuity that should make your stomach turn. The century changes, the technology improves, the vocabulary modernizes, and the decision stays the same. Do not disturb. Do not count. Do not make it official. And the report has a second function. It creates a shield for anyone who wants to claim innocence later. We followed procedure. We respected sensitivity. We complied. Compliance becomes the new moral disguise. But compliance with what? With a system of avoidance. With a framework that treats a burial ground as an obstacle to be managed rather than a crime scene to be understood. In that framework, the institution can look responsible while doing exactly what the plantation did in 1851. Keep the exit hidden. This is why the private archive matters more than ever. Because the private archive is not written in the language of liability. It is written in the language of human insistence. It says, these were people, not anomalies. It says, the absences were patterned, not random. It says, the no-escape myth is a cover story, and the cover story protected the perpetrators and punished the victims twice, once in life, once in memory. If you're listening and thinking, but without excavation, we can't be sure. Understand how that sentence has been weaponized across generations. Uncertainty can be manufactured. Unknowns can be maintained. The absence of proof can be preserved as a strategy. And when institutions recommend against excavation, they are not merely protecting the ground. They are protecting the privilege of not knowing. So here is the ethical demand this record makes of us. Do not confuse procedural caution with moral resolution. Do not let technical language anesthetize you. A report that detects anomalies and recommends avoidance is not closure. It is a modern form of sealing the file. It is silence dressed up as professionalism. In 1851, the plantation's reputation claimed no one escaped. After the war, scraps of truth start leaking into new paperwork, but the institution adapts. Over the decades, a private archive keeps the dangerous pages alive while the public story stays clean. And in the modern era, even when technology can see what the ledger tried to hide, the recommendation is still the same old order. translated into polite language. Leave it buried. But that is not neutrality. That is policy. And policy has victims. Our responsibility is to refuse the comfort of sanitized conclusions and insist on the only thing the machine has always feared: names, counts, and the public record of what was done. We are at the end of the trail now, which means we have to do something institutions hate. Separate what can be proven from what they have successfully kept unknown. Not to be fair to the system that engineered silence, but to be precise, to deny them the comfort of calling this all rumor. Precision is a form of accountability. And in a case like this, Louisiana, 1851, the plantation where no one escaped, precision is how you turn a legend into an indictment. What we can prove is not one dramatic confession. It's a pattern that repeats across different kinds of records in different eras. First, the workforce is documented in a way that makes disappearance easy. People appear as first names, categories, tallies. They vanish with minimal notation. Second, the vanishings are not evenly distributed. They cluster around pressure points: injury, punishment, peak season, outbreaks, moments of heightened control. Third, the paper responds to vanishings not with investigation, but with substitution. New names occupy old slots. Replacements are requested. Output expectations continue. Fourth, when outside leverage demands answers, owners, creditors, anyone whose financial interest is disrupted, the institution responds quickly and vaguely, and only under that pressure do admissions leak through. Not full facts, but enough to confirm that missing was not an error. Fifth, when later decades disturb the ground, the same institutional reflex appears in modern clothing. Discover, restrict, avoid, reseal. The vocabulary changes. The decision does not. That is what we can prove. A system of record-keeping and management that makes uncounted death plausible, and a system of institutional behavior that repeatedly chooses concealment over clarity. You don't need to invent monsters when the archive itself shows you the method. Names erased. Bodies uncounted. Discoveries reburied. Silence as procedure. Now, what we can infer, carefully, responsibly, but without flinching, is the exit. The plantation's reputation says no one escaped. If we take that reputation seriously as a description of outcomes, it forces a question that cannot be answered by fences and patrols alone. People do not simply stop running because the river is wide. They stop running when the consequences are final. When flight is answered not with retrieval, but with elimination. When the attempt to leave becomes the last thing you ever do. That is the inference supported by the converging evidence. The plantation's no-escape claim functioned as a deterrent because the system had a way to permanently remove those who threatened it without producing a public record of the removal. The exit, being burial, is not a ghost story. It is the most mundane, brutal logic available to a system that needed to keep its reputation intact. Unmarked burial on plantation land solves multiple problems at once. It disposes of bodies, prevents witnesses from pointing to a grave, and ensures that later generations can claim ignorance. And when modern surveys detect anomalies consistent with graves and recommend against disturbance, the continuity becomes sickeningly clear. The ground that swallowed people in 1851 is still being asked to swallow proof in the present. There are unknowns that remain unknown, and it's important to name why. We do not have complete lists of the missing because the system did not want complete lists to exist. We do not have precise death dates for many individuals because euphemism was the record's native language. We do not have marked graves because the absence of markers was part of the concealment. We do not have the full chain of custody for the later discoveries because reports can be restricted, drafts can be withheld, and findings can be managed into silence. These unknowns are not merely the fog of time. They are the product of choices made by people who understood that evidence is dangerous. So when you hear someone say, "We can't know," you should ask, "Can't or weren't allowed?" Because there is a difference between history losing facts and institutions burying them. And now we return to the beginning, to that modern discovery, the one that triggered the shutdown, the one wrapped in clean language. In the cold open, the ground spoke through patterns. The official response was immediate. Halt, restrict, avoid. With everything we've laid out, that reaction is no longer mysterious. It is familiar. It is the same procedure, updated. In 1851, the plantation protected itself by controlling movement and controlling paper. In the modern era, the institution protects itself by controlling access and controlling interpretation. The goal is identical. Prevent the creation of a new, undeniable archive. This is the moral truth that must be said plainly. Reputation was protected at human cost. Not once. Systematically. The plantation's name, the owner's standing, the smooth continuation of commerce, those were treated as sacred. Human beings were treated as replaceable, disposable, forgettable. And when a society accepts that trade, it does not just commit a crime against the dead. It commits a crime against memory itself. Because memory is the only courtroom many victims will ever get. So what do we do with the names that refuse to disappear? We reconstruct what we can. We take the fragments seriously. We treat partial names as real people, not footnotes. We refuse the comfort of abstraction. We remember that an initial scratched into metal is not interesting. It is a signature left by someone who was denied the right to sign anything else. We remember that a list with crossed out lines is not messy bookkeeping. It is a map of who was erased. We remember that a sensitive area on a modern site plan is not neutral. It is often a cemetery hiding behind a euphemism. And here is the closing symbol I can't escape. The concept of an exit. On most plantations, escape routes were imagined as rivers, woods, swamp paths, friendly houses. But on this plantation, the one whose brand was that nobody ever made it out, the exit was inverted. The exit was downward. The exit was silence. The exit was a place where the record stopped and the ground took over. If you're looking for a single villain, you'll miss the point. The villain is the procedure. The villain is the repeatable decision. Erase, substitute, reseal. The villain is the comfort of people who benefit from not knowing. And the only antidote is deliberate witness. Insisting that the missing count. Insisting that the dead are not anomalies. Insisting that the archive is not complete until it includes the people it was designed to omit. So I'll end the way these stories have to end, not with closure, but with responsibility. If you are listening from anywhere, comment where you're from. Not as a gimmick. As a reminder that this is not just Louisiana's history. The technique travels. The language travels. The policy of silence travels. And the question travels too, waiting for someone stubborn enough to ask it again. If no one escaped, then where did they go? And who, today, is still trying to keep that answer buried?